If you click this video, I imagine one of your first questions must be, how could you choose Babolat over Yonex? Especially when the quality control for Yonex is so much better. And that is a great question. We're going to answer that. I'm going to talk about a few things, including what exactly is quality control. Some people I think are going to say that's really obvious, it's just quality. But I want to put that into context and explain from my perspective where that doesn't necessarily matter, because that plays in a lot with why I would choose Babolat over Yonex. And to some degree, what we're going to talk about will give you a sense of what makes a Yonex and what makes a Babolat. And I think that might be the more deciding factor, because let's get right into it. Quality control. When we're talking about established brands, quality control, comparing Yonex to Babolat, it doesn't mean that Babolat's quality control is worse and therefore the rackets are more likely to break or snap for no reason or play terribly. It doesn't mean that at all. I really think that the most meaningful observation of quality control is really just the consistency you can expect from one Yonex racket to the next. And I'm talking about things like the weight, the balance, the swing weight. If you grab any random Yonex racket, I think it's much more likely to be closer to the advertised spec than pretty much any other brand. And that's really cool. That means the experience from one player to the next is going to be influenced less by a bias of the racket just being lighter or the balance being different, etc. Because again, you can expect one Yonex to be more similar to the next one than you can with other brands. But I want to be very clear about this. I think quality control kind of has this power just in the word to imply that it's actually a better racket. And I wouldn't say that it is. I think the only objective thing that you can say is that there is more consistency at the end of manufacturing the racket. I don't actually know if the craftsmanship of Yonex is better, if the materials are actually better, if over time the Yonex rackets hold up better. To be honest, I don't really think so. Maybe if you take a racket like the Regna and compare it to the rest of rackets, okay, maybe there's a case to be made there, but that racket is much more expensive. And if you're doing that kind of a comparison, I think it'd be fair to just say pro stock rackets would have a similar elevated sense of quality. So in that sense, I just want to say that I think the only meaningful difference when it comes to quality control is specifically for details like weight and balance, how those things affect swing weight, etc. Because Yonex has a smaller margin of differences that they allow than other brands. And Yonex is unique because they make their rackets in-house. In other words, Yonex is the only big name brand that designs and manufactures their racket in the same country. Everybody else pretty much engineers their rackets in whatever the home country is, and it gets manufactured in China. But you guys shouldn't underestimate China. China is the world's leader in manufacturing for a reason. It's not just the more affordable labor. You guys have to imagine, it's been this way for quite some time with China. Like, they've gotten better and better and better. And you have some of the most established companies in the world doing their manufacturing over there. Do you think that those companies would compromise on the quality of their product that much? I think the fact that China's been getting that kind of business from other businesses for so long at that large of a scale means that that country has had so much more opportunity to perfect the craft of what they do. So the long story short is quality control. I really almost want to say that it's tolerance control, because the word quality is associated with quality. But really what we're talking about here is tolerance. And the biggest difference between those brands compared to Yonex is that smaller window of tolerance. And the thing is, there are matching services. If that's the biggest issue for you, and that's the reason you go to Yonex is because their tolerance window is actually smaller, is that enough of a reason to push you away from another racket that might actually work better for you if you could find the one within the specs that actually work for you? Some people will say yes, others will say no. And for me, I'm on the side of no. I think it's great if you can get a racket that is closer to the advertised spec, but it might be the case that the advertised spec actually doesn't work quite as well for you as one that's, let's say, a little bit heavier or a little bit lighter. So this is going to get funny, but let's talk now about the next point. One nice thing about a company like Babolat and so on with a wider range of variations or a wider window of tolerance is, if I want something that's a little bit lighter than the advertised spec, if I'm determined enough to, I can probably find it. Whereas with Yonex, it probably doesn't exist. And the way that Yonex is going to close these gaps is by adding weight here and there, etc., to make the racket be closer to the advertised spec. I don't think it's a case where the actual material and the structure is all that different. So it might sound crazy, but that is kind of the silver lining with a wider range of tolerance. I've said this in previous videos, but I've found it frustrating that so many 18x20s are just such high swing weight rackets off the bat. But the beauty is, if you get a brand like Wilson or Babolat, etc., you can find one that's probably 10, maybe even 15 points lighter in swing weight than the advertised swing weight. And that's great. And now I have the tools to actually measure that for myself. So if you want to be crazy like me, you could take my Graffiti swing weight tool, which I'll leave a link to in the description. It's a great product. I don't get any commission for this. I'm just shouting it out because I think it's a groundbreaking tool. And it's really opened the doors for me to be even more picky, but with intention. So it's really great. I'm glad I have this tool. Anyway, you could take that to a tennis shop. And let's say, for example, you want a Pure Aero 98. Let's say that you want to buy 2 of them. You could measure all the Pure Aero 98s in that shop, if they will permit you to do this. Some shops have their own swing weight machine, but if they don't, and you're me, you have your own, so it's all good. You could take 10 of them off the wall, let's say if you find 10 that are in your grip size, and you could measure the swing weight of every single one of them, and then pick the 2 that are closest to each other, or pick the 2 that you think are closer to the spec that you want. You can even measure twist weight with the Graffiti tool, just throwing that in there. And if your goal is to find the 2 lightest swing weight rackets, you can do that. And getting the ones with the lighter swing weight will allow you a larger window to customize the racket to your own preferences. Because with a lower swing weight, you can increase that how you want and where you want. You could add the weight closer to the 12 area, and that way you'd bump up the swing weight without increasing the twist weight, or you could really concentrate it around the 3 and the 9 area and bump up that swing weight as well as the twist weight quite a lot. Or you could just leave it and enjoy having a lighter swing weight version of this racket that has a higher advertised spec. And that is the beauty of having a wider tolerance on these rackets. Now, obviously, the flip side is that if you buy 2 rackets and don't do any of this stuff, there's a decent chance that your rackets are going to be noticeably different. Like one might have a lot more plow through than the other. And a lot of people experience this and they don't really understand why. It's not really until you get into the rabbit hole of understanding weight and balance and swing weight and realize that you can actually get 2 rackets that are more similar that people even begin to consider this. And a lot of people know that about their rackets, but they don't care. It's nice to have 2 rackets that are the same but a little different. So I get that too. In other words, the whole point of everything I just said is to say that for me, it's actually kind of nice to have a little variation in quality control because it allows me to pick a racket in the direction of the specs I want. Whereas with Yonex, you kind of just get what's advertised, and you're not really going to be able to find a Yonex in a large pile that's very different from the next. And it might just so happen that the advertised spec is not what you're looking for, and you're not going to be able to find something that's different enough. So that's what I have to say about quality control. With the right tools, a wide range of tolerance can be a blessing in disguise. And for me, it absolutely is, especially now that I have the Graffiti swing weight tool. Again, link will be down below. It's like $250. You need a smartphone to use it. You guys all have smartphones, I'm sure. It's an amazing, groundbreaking tool. Every tennis shop should have one. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. You can check it out if you want. Now, on to the next points. And I think this point should actually be more important. The reality is that I never really fully meshed with a Yonex racket. So as much as I wanted to at the time when I really cared about quality control, I wanted things to work with a Yonex racket, but it just never happened. Yonex only offers like 3 lines of rackets, unless you want to throw in the Regna, I guess that's 4. And if I had to pick one, actually, I probably would pick the Regna. It's a very special racket. But all of the V-Core Pros are too mushy and too flexy for me. Good access to spin, but honestly, just like put away power isn't quite there. It's fine, not quite for me, but it does feel really good, so I wanted to like it. The E-zones are all too powerful, and I could never quite get over that. It's nice when you want it, but when you don't want it, it's still there. It's always there. So I'm not quite an E-zone guy either. Although if I had to pick between E-zone and V-Core Pro, I'd probably pick E-zone. And then you have the V-Core series, which is a weird one because you have the 95. It stands out so much from the other V-Core series. I don't even know which one of those I would pick. I don't think any of those rackets are too anything, but I've always felt like all of them are not enough of another thing. I'll do a Yonex breakdown video. I'll tell you guys my opinions and thoughts and who each racket lineup might actually be for. I don't want to get into that here, but the long story short is that I was never able to really mesh as well with Yonex as I have with other brands. But for quite some time, I really, really wanted to. again, for the tighter spec control that Yonex had. I just respected it more. And look, here's the other thing too. This is getting into some silly territory, but I have some very particular preferences. I've talked about parallel drilling. I've talked about small grommet holes. Now, Yonex is really good about parallel drilling, and when I became aware of it, it made me appreciate Yonex more. But then I became aware of how that can cause crooked crosses, especially if the grommets are larger. And Yonex grommet holes are on the larger side. So unfortunately, on a Yonex racket, I can see crooked alignment with the crosses. And it's not as bad on Yonex as some other brands like the Head Speed Pro. That one's pretty bad. I think the worst racket I've ever seen is the Blade 16x19, although it's pretty much equally as noticeable on the 18x20. It's just that the 16x19 is spaced more further apart. And I mean, you can just see the crosses kind of alternating in this kind of pattern. If you guys want to see what I'm talking about, I did make a video on that recently. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to see. But you've been warned, once you see it, you might not be able to unsee it. And if you're a little bit OCD, like me, it might drive you crazy. So don't look if you don't think you can handle it. So now my perfect racket must have parallel drilling as well as small grommet holes. And I actually care more about the small grommet holes than the parallel drilling, just because having crooked crosses drives me that insane. But if I can have small grommets and have parallel drilling, that's like cherry on top, you know? So yeah, in a perfect world, my racket would have both. And so that is where Babolat comes in. And as somebody who is obviously very obsessed and nitpicky with an eye for detail, arguably for things that may or may not matter so much, you know, that's debatable. Regardless, the fact is that these are my preferences and I care very much about them, and I can't really help that. You know, you can't really help what you like. Some people just love potato chips and they can't help but love potato chips. Too bad. Right? Too bad if you wish that you didn't like potato chips, but you do. And they're everywhere, like at every store for like $2 or $3. And it's the same thing with me. I can't help but like parallel drilling and small grommets. So let's not talk about how that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it doesn't matter, because it still matters to me even if it doesn't matter. That being said though, if it truly doesn't matter, then why would a company like Babolat actually take the time to engineer and design, manufacture their rackets with small grommet holes and parallel drilling if it just doesn't matter? Again, I'm not making the argument that it does or doesn't matter, but the fact is that Babolat cares enough to manufacture their rackets with these preferences I happen to have. So Babolat cares. And as far as how much that matters or not, I'll just leave that to you guys to decide. I'm not really going to try to get into that debate. Let's stick to the facts. The facts are that I care, and the fact is that this racket has both. And that is one reason, after acquiring the preference most recently, which is the small grommets, after parallel drilling, that's in order of when I started to care. I care about the small grommet holes more now. This racket was really on my radar, and I've played with it a couple times. Back in the days when I was all about that E-Zone 98, this racket was somewhat of a contender in my book because it played similarly in so many ways, but it was more stable at the time. I was like, you know what, this is a really competitive racket, but I still prefer the E-Zone at the time because the strings were more closely spaced together. So I thought effectively it has a denser string pattern, despite that this is a 16x20 and that is a 16x19. Anyway, the times and preferences have changed a little bit since then. These days, I would absolutely pick a Pure Aero 98 over the E-Zone 98. And I care less about a more open string spacing or more open string pattern because the strings I use these days are so durable. I use Restring Zero religiously and Toroline Wasabi religiously. Both of those strings massively outperform anything else when it comes to things like topspin and durability, which means when compared to a string like Solinco Tourbite or Hyper-G or RPM Blast, the list just goes on, any big name brand, durable poly, whatever, these last me at least twice as long. And so back in the day when I was breaking strings like every 3 to 5 hitting sessions with 16 or 17 gauge polyester strings, I resented rackets that had an open enough string pattern to make it so that I break strings even sooner. Like even with a dense string pattern, I only get 4 to 5 hitting sessions out of a tennis string. Like that's really frustrating. As somebody that plays every day, it means I have to string my own rackets more than once a week. And that's just the reality for a lot of players that hit this hard, but it'd be nice if it were possible to extend that to like 2 weeks. And that's exactly what I get with Restring Zero. Obviously, I wouldn't compromise on my tennis to get that kind of durability and spin. It just so happens that this string plays amazingly as well as being twice as durable. But the secret really is in the topspin because the friction is so reduced that the strings aren't eating into themselves. You know how your strings notch If you're me, a string like Hyper G is going to start notching in like 10 minutes. It's that notching that eventually breaks the strings because it just keeps notching deeper and deeper. It's the strings eating into themselves. Obviously, the harder you hit and the more spin you hit with, the quicker you're going to break those strings. My point is that strings like Toraline, Wasabi, and Restring Zero reduce that friction so much. That's why you get so much durability out of it. It's not like this string is overbuilt and it's just so tight and so dense and stiff and durable. It's not. It just isn't destroying itself. So I cannot speak highly enough about Restring Zero and Toraline Wasabi. You can use my code to get 10% off of Restring Zero, 20% off of Toraline Wasabi, or any Toraline string for that matter, but I highly recommend Wasabi. Or Wasabi X. I've got that in this racket and I'm trying that combo out. It's Wasabi with a round Wasabi in the crosses, which is pretty cool. So I'm still getting to know Wasabi X, but as far as I can tell, super legitimate hybrid. Anyway, the reason I'm so glad that I found these strings is because it opened the doors a little bit more for me. It means that these strings are so durable that I can actually afford to open up the string bed a little bit and still get a lot of lifespan from the strings because they're just that durable. And yes, a more open string pattern is going to give you more spin, which I love. I'm very into that. And I feel that on this racket compared to other more dense string patterns that I've been messing with for a while. I get crazy spin and shape on the ball with this racket, and I like that. But before I was using Zero or Wasabi, a string pattern this open just meant so much less time that my strings would survive in the racket. That being said, this isn't the most open string pattern, but it's certainly not the most closed. It's somewhere in the middle. The EZO 98 is definitely a bit tighter, and a lot of 18x20s are also a little bit tighter. But this string pattern is a very happy medium, I think, between something dense and something open. So let's move on to the next point. I was talking earlier about how thoughtful Babolat's engineering is by having both parallel drilling and small grommet holes. These are very specific details that are completely ignored by most of the tennis market. In fact, a lot of companies now don't even go out of their way to market these things. And I kind of think that they're missing out on an opportunity here. But my point is that a lot of thought definitely went into the engineering and design of this racket to the point that it's parallel drilled and has small grommet holes. My point is that Babolat engineers have obviously put a lot of thought into this racket. A lot of things are marketed, so even on the surface, some of these qualities are obvious, but I'm saying that even details like parallel drilling and small grommets made it to this racket. So if those are on this racket, you can only imagine other details that also mattered to the people engineering this racket. And so when I look at a racket that just has that much going on, I look at this and think, man, what could be better? And I'll tell you what, I noticed this the other day, I made a little short about it. The grommets are even cut in a way that is so detail oriented. Most grommets are just like a little plastic cylinder that poke through the grommet hole. These grommets are actually cut to follow the shape of the racket head. And that to me shows a level and attention to detail that is unparalleled. No puns intended with parallel drilling. But seriously, and I don't see that kind of attention to detail in Yonex rackets despite the higher level of quality control or tolerance. They do have parallel drilling, but the grommet holes are large, and I do see crooked crosses, and just on a personal level that really bothers me, and separately from that, I never really gelled with the Yonex racket. The funny thing with Yonex too, I was saying, is that they only have a racket lineup of 3. I wonder if they'd benefit from having a 4th, excluding the Regna, or maybe even bringing the Regna in and making that like a 4th racket lineup. But Babolat has more options, right? You got the Pure Drive, the Pure Aero series, and now you got the Pure Aero 98 and the Pure Drive 98. I know those two kind of belong to their own families, but that is like another dimension of those lineups. Like even between the Pure Drives and the Pure Aeros, there's a lot of options for a lot of players. But let's not also forget the Pure Strike. And then you got the Pure Strike VS. I'm double checking there isn't like a Babolat racket lineup that I'm forgetting about. I feel like there is. Oh yeah, you got the Pure Aero Rafas. So I think Babolat has really found their niche. And when I say niche, it sounds weird because they're obviously one of the most successful and widest range of player styles and levels rackets. It's almost like it's weird to use a word like niche because they're so dominating. But I would say that their rackets are more so on the stiffer and spin-friendly side. Recently, Babolat has softened things up on the flex ratings a bit, and I really like that. A few years back, I was kind of an anti-Babolat guy. Now, they've made some tweaks, and I've had a lot of adjustments in my preferences over the years. I used to be a Babolat guy, and then I was like anti-Babolat for a long time. Partly just because of how mainstream they were. It's like, gosh, everyone just wants to hit a ball like Nadal. Everyone's got a freaking Pure Aero. I got kind of tired of it. I wanted something more versatile. But the weird thing with with Babolat is you see people that sometimes hit really flat and sometimes with a lot of spin, and they're sometimes using like the same racket. So to me, it's like, how is that one racket so popular among both completely different audiences of player styles? So I've actually really come around to having a lot of respect for Babolat. I think they make some of the best rackets. Now, I can't factually say that they have the tightest tolerance control, but they do even offer paired rackets. And that's a thoughtfulness thing too, because they know that their audience wants matched rackets. They know that some of their tennis audience is really serious about having a consistent experience. So they set things up to be able to cater to that audience. And I think that's also very thoughtful. And I picked up 2 random demos. It just so happens that these rackets seem matched. They're like a gram apart. Their balance is the same. Their swing weight is, I think, within 0.02 of each other. That's basically matched. I think the shot that I demoed them from must have gotten a matched pair, or I just got incredibly lucky, because I've definitely measured pure arrows that were like 10 units apart in swing weight unstrung. So that's funny, because I'm actually kind of doing this A and B thing. I'm making one racket kind of my reference racket, and then another one that I'm playing around with to understand like how far my experience is deviating from the more stock experience. That's why I have 2 rackets, so it's also very lucky that they just happen to be so close in specs unstrung. I do really like this racket, but I also want to make it clear I wouldn't have bothered probably to try this racket if it didn't already match some of the specs that I care so much about, namely small grommet holes, parallel drilling, not too open of a string pattern. Something a little more dense than a 16 by 19 is ideal. 16 by 20, cool. It's a little more open, but no big deal. My strings are super durable, and I can enjoy the benefits of more spin from a more open string pattern. So all good, let's give it a try. And I gotta say, so far I am loving it. I strung this one a little bit too low. I've been playing with such dense string patterns that I'm used to stringing in like the low 40s or the high 30s. I knew better and did this one at 45, but I think at least with Wasabi X, that's a little bit low. So this one is a little bit launchy. This one is strung with restring 0, and I think with a string like restring 0, you can go a little bit lower than you can on Wasabi. It holds tension a little better, but it's also a little bit more stiff, crisp, etc. Maybe a lower powered string. I strung this a little bit higher than I strung Wasabi. I strung this at 48 in the mains, 47 in the crosses. The reason I do that little 1 pound difference is because, again, there's so little friction on these strings. Most strings, when you're pulling the crosses, there's a lot of friction to overcome. So naturally, the net tension that you actually pull will be less than it will be on a string with less friction. So in order to imitate that lower net tension that you would get from a string with more friction, which is pretty much anything except these 2 strings, I decide sometimes to string the crosses just 1 pound lower. Anyway, haven't hit with this yet, but I am excited to. 48 pounds, I have a good feeling about it, we'll see. And I think that pretty much wraps up my point about why I would pick Babolat over Yonex. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. But there is one more point that I decided to leave out for this video, and it's I would love to talk about the isometric design that is unique to Yonex. I have some opinions about it, and I'm gonna try to make that video from an angle of my perspective and my thoughts. I'm not gonna try to make too strong of a case, but I wanna present some ideas, some thoughts, and some theories, observations to you guys, and maybe together we can kind of see how we feel about the isometric head shape. And in that video, I might actually reveal a few things to you guys that you wouldn't have thought about or wouldn't have known, and some things I've found out doing more research during the period that I had the Yonex Regna. There are some funny and unexpected things I discovered about isometric. So I do plan to make a video on that. It'll probably be different from my Yonex breakdown video, but yeah, I do have some opinions. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Please check out my links below if you want to support the channel. I think I'll set up a thing too where you guys can just like buy me coffee or whatever. And that way you can kind of more directly support the channel. That way you don't have to like buy strings or something and then I get a small commission. You can just get me coffee and I'll just directly get that. And I'll tell you this right now, I don't really blow my money on coffee. I make it myself. So if you guys decide to support me through coffee, you guys can know that it's not really being blown on coffee. That will be spent to help me keep making videos and content like this. I make my coffee at home on the cheap, but I do it real nice. Anyway, check out those links and definitely check out these strings if you haven't. I can't swear by them enough. Obviously, I really love these strings. I'm continuously impressed and blown away by them. They still almost seem too good to be true, but I promise that they're not. If you can love these strings, you will be so happy because you will get more spin and more life out of them. So if these strings work for you, you're gonna be spoiled. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. And you can even follow me on Instagram. There's a link for that below as well. And I will see you guys in a future video. All right, take care. Happy hitting. Boom!